So I'm pleased to introduce our Strand 4 talk speaker for day 3, Angelos Bollas. Angelos is a teacher trainer, and researcher. He works primarily on pre- and in-service teacher training courses and teaches academic writing at university level. As a researcher, he focuses on sexuality, culture, and society. Okay, during this talk, we recommend you watching in speaker view. And if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. Okay, so please take it away and share your screen, Angelos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Just give me a moment to do that. This should be working now. All right, okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hi there. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to the YLTC for organizing this truly amazing conference. Happy birthday to you and congratulations to the event organizers. I'd also like to thank everyone who is here today. My understanding is that if you are here, you have already been thinking about incorporating equality, diversity, and inclusion in your lessons or your courses, which means that I do not have much to say really to you. However, I hope that my talk might give you something to think about when other people, administrators, academic managers, parents, challenge you for adopting an equality, diversity, and inclusion approach. My argument today is that EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion, is an integral part of every educator's professional obligation. And in the course of the next 20 minutes, I aim to do two things. First, I aim to support my argument by referring to relevant literature. And second, I want to present you with 10 tips that might help those among us who might not be sure where to start from. So some housekeeping first. Please use the chat to share ideas, suggestions, recommendations with one another. I'm very much looking forward to learning from each one of you. If you have questions that you want to address to me, please use the Q&A pod, and I will address these in about 19 minutes from now. Now, 3 notes. Note 1, in preparing and presenting this talk today, I acknowledge that I come from a privileged place as a white European man with access to education. I've tried my best to refer to research conducted by scholars who are not as privileged as I have been, but I'm aware that there are many more voices that need to be heard. Note 2, all images used in this presentation are licensed under Creative Commons License 3. They come from pixabay.com and no changes have been made to them. Note 3, every time you see me holding my hand up means that I'm quoting someone else's words. All right, so I think we are ready to start. Questions about equality, diversity, and inclusive practices in education and whether to adopt such practices or not are rooted in what we understand education to be and what we understand our role as teachers to be. Griffiths in 2012 identifies education to have a dual role, an instrumental one, preparing students for employment opportunities, status attainment, and material gain, and an inherent one, developing values and preparing students to live as citizens. How these are implemented often, if not always, depends on the prevailing ideologies of governments. There is no doubt that Western neoliberalism has promoted a faux idea that schools and educational institutions are businesses where individualism and the potential for material success are prioritized over citizenship and information literacy. This shift of focus has transformed teaching into what Pring in 2012 calls a science of deliverology, with teachers focusing on what is absolutely necessary for the student's success in their chosen fields. Teachers saying, I only teach language, I only teach maths. As an antidote to the neoliberal approach to the role of education, I would like to refer to the philosopher John McMurray, who advocated in favor of teaching emotions, of teaching students the importance of relationships, of caring for one another. He argued that a development of truly democratic culture starts at school, and the teacher's role is none other than helping students understand that a good life is a life lived together with others and helping them learn how this can be achieved. Fazer in 2012 argues that we categorize our relationships with others into functional and personal. Functional relations refer to instrumental interactions whereby we form a relationship because I need something from you to achieve my goal, and you need something from me to achieve your goal. Personal relations involve mutual understanding of one another as the basis of interaction. McMurray highlights that no matter what drives people to interact with one another, at the basis of everything should be an understanding and recognition that the other is inherently and essentially human. Fielding in 2012 understands McMurray's commitment to education as a means of developing more other-regarding understandings of human flourishing, and argues for its significance at a time when the othering of students who do not fit into what society perceives as normal is promoted more than ever before. Reflecting on McMurray's approach, Rutherford finds Slee's understanding of the purpose of education as an apprenticeship in democracy inadequate. Instead, she urges us to rethink the purpose of education as an apprenticeship in humanity. Morton et al. In 2021 acknowledged the contributions education systems and schools make to a socially cohesive civil society and to effective citizenship, and refers us to Slee's 3 questions that should govern our decisions about transforming current educational system towards equality, diversity, and inclusive practices. These questions are: what kind of world we want our children and young people to live in? What kind of schools and classrooms are required to achieve that world? When we look at our schools, who is in, who is out, who decides, and what we're going to do about it? Kayi et al. In 2019 argue that for teachers to become advocates for social justice, challenge social oppression, and advance equity within minoritized language learning and teaching communities, it is imperative that we focus on developing language teachers' identity. That is how they think and act in a manner that prepares them to promote inclusive education. Rutherford in 2016 writes about teacher education. Teacher education is charged with the responsibility of developing new teachers and attesting to their competence in meeting the standards required for formal admission to the teaching profession. Aspiring teachers enter teacher education with their own beliefs about teaching and learning that have developed through immersion in an apprenticeship of observation throughout their time in school. These beliefs may include an untroubled internalization of deficit ideologies. How teacher educators work with student teachers to make the latter visible, to make the familiar unfamiliar, is therefore of critical importance. And it is at this juncture that teacher educators have an opportunity to break the cycle of discriminatory thinking. An example of such a program can be found in the Teacher Education for Inclusion project by the European Agency for Special and Inclusive Education in 2012, which looked at how teachers are prepared to work in inclusive settings and identified 4 core values that undergird particular areas of competence that should be developed in teacher education. These include valuing learner diversity, supporting all learners, working with others, and continuing personal professional development. A similar attempt to highlight the importance of equality, diversity, and inclusion has been undertaken by the United Nations. Indeed, the 4th Sustainable Development Goal of the United Nations reads, to ensure inclusive and equitable education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. For those who do not want to understand, all means all. Professor Allen this year explains that inclusive education is both a necessary means of upholding individuals' right to education and of ensuring the full development of human potential and sense of dignity and self-worth of our students, enabling them their full participation in society. Professor Allen also reflects on possibilities for inclusive education and invites us to rethink education and identify mechanisms to support and enhance accessibility and inclusion. For this, she calls for a stronger reorientation to democratic values and human rights, which involves engaging children and young people in the project of inclusive education, privileging education and pedagogy over pathology, renewing teacher education, and troubling difference. Indeed, research supports children's engagement in creating inclusive environments. Einskow and Maysu's 2018 study confirms that children and young people, when asked about inclusive education, have demonstrated both clarity and wisdom and have appeared to see it as worth striving for. Allen states that children appear to be unfazed by difference and find exposure to it stimulating, interesting, and educative. Allen's 3rd point was about renewing teacher education. And on this, McWhorter in 25 writes, the point here is not to feel bad about the injustice or suffering in the world. The point is to pull up short before the possibility that what you thought was true might not be, that what you thought was normal or natural might be the product of political struggle, and to start from just that place, to think, which means to question, to critique, to experiment, to wonder, to imagine, to try. Sharing McWhorter's position, I also argued that inclusion might not be as productive a term. It would not be surprising if inclusion was used in a tokenistic manner. Let's do the gay lesson today. Let's tick the box. Let's meet the requirements. Thanks for playing. Earlier this year, I proposed that we stop focusing on the promotion of inclusion, but we adopt approaches and practices which celebrate diversity. Inclusion can be viewed as a practice which inevitably encompasses forms and practices of exclusion. Who gets to decide who is or should be the norm, and to what cost to those who happen to be ruled out of it, are just examples of how power formations come into play when we focus on inclusion. Diversity focuses on the deconstruction of the norm. In other words, an approach that focuses on promoting diversity is an approach that does not aim to expand what is included and accepted as part of mainstream society and culture. Rather, it renounces altogether the existence of a norm. Such an approach can be effective for three reasons. Firstly, it is not invasive and can therefore be adopted by educators in all places and all cultures. Secondly, it does not recognize and it does not endorse any one behavior and practice as normative. Finally, an approach on diversity rather than inclusion is primarily an approach that focuses on language. Therefore, it can be applicable and easily adopted by language educators. Focusing on language education seeks to empower learners to interact and engage with difference. It aims to equip learners with linguistic tools that will allow them to coexist peacefully with others, despite the fact that they may not understand why they live their lives in a certain different manner. It is an approach that does not explicitly address matters of a certain diversity. Rather, it enables learners to perceive and celebrate what is different to them as diverse. The aim of such an approach is not to teach learners to accept one identity over another. The main goal of this is not to change learners' mindsets or beliefs, but to provide them with the necessary tools that will allow them to interact with others in a peaceful manner. I hope that by now I've made it clear that equality, diversity, and inclusion are not add-ons that the brave and courageous teachers among us incorporate to their practice. Rather, it is every educator's responsibility to ensure, one, that they teach lessons that are relevant to all, two, that their classes are safe spaces for all, and three, that they teach the citizens of tomorrow. In the remaining part of this talk, I'd like to offer 10 tips that might help those among us who might not be sure where to start from. Number one, ask yourself what kind of educator you want to be, what you know, what you want to find out, and how your practices contribute or not to the creation of a safe space for all. Equality, diversity, and inclusion require commitment and require consistency. Neither of these can be achieved if we do not believe in what we do. The literature I presented earlier, and there is so much more written about this, confirms that the teacher identity and teacher beliefs are very much linked to what our teaching practices are. Verbalizing, even if it is to ourselves, what our teaching beliefs are will allow us to identify our own unconscious biases, but it will also allow us to find the motivation and strength to talk the talk and walk the walk. Two, get institutional support. Teachers alone cannot and should not adopt an EDI practice. It is your university, it is your school, your high school, your secondary school, your primary school that needs to have policies in place that support the learners, but also policies in place that support you. You also need to get institutional support to receive advice from experts, people who know, who study, who work within the field of equality, diversity, and inclusion. As teachers, we're not prepared for everything, but we should be able to ask and receive help. Adopt a zero tolerance policy. More and more studies confirm child protection and safeguarding being a significant part of a teacher's, let alone a young learner teacher's professional obligation. We need to ensure that in our classes, in our classrooms, face-to-face online, nobody feels rejected, and nobody gets hurt, even if what somebody says might not be addressed directly at someone else in our classes, we should be careful because we don't know where every student comes from and what they've gone through. Do not cancel, do not silence in-class incidents of discriminatory behavior. Stop them, but follow them up. Talk to the student, talk to the parent, talk to the school counselor if you have one. Make sure you address where this discriminatory behavior comes from and how this is not going to be repeated. Involve the parents. They should be able to support you, but also they should let you know how they want you to support them. In this process, we are in it together. So we should be explaining to them the importance of keeping the classroom safe, keeping the classroom, making the classroom an environment where everyone's voice is valued and where everyone's voice is heard. Critically select learning materials. I believe in this conference, there have been quite a few talks looking at materials and how materials themselves promote a particular monocultural, monosexual idea of what normal is. Be ready to adapt learning materials, to expand them, or to challenge them in your lessons. Teach inclusive language. We are teaching a foreign language, so it is important to teach our learners what is appropriate, what is acceptable to say, and what is not acceptable to say, which terms we can use and which terms we cannot use. Teach the singular they when you refer to someone and you don't know their gender identification. Use games that encourage cooperation, that allow learners to work collaboratively, to work together, to work in small groups, to learn working in teams, to learn listening to each other's voice, to each other's idea, to each other's opinion, but also monitor this process carefully. Ensure that learners are working together in a respectful manner and be ready to act, be ready to react if somebody exhibits a sign of discriminatory behavior. Use storytelling to convey ideas about democracy, to convey ideas about citizenship, to convey ideas about society, about people, about difference. And finally, make a decision today to review your practice. And before you walk into your next lesson, take a moment to consider how you are going to react, how you are going to behave, who you are going to address, and how you will ensure that everyone in your class feels safe, valued, and respected. Thank you very much, everyone. I will stop my presentation here, and I will have a look at your questions. All right, so we have there's a very good question here asking how I can achieve inclusion when we have large classes. And this goes back to what I said earlier about not turning inclusion into not approaching inclusion in a tokenistic manner. It's not about addressing a problem. It's not about talking about a certain identity. It's not about making a point. It's about including materials that challenge what we know to be the norm, what we know to be normal. Asking learners why that is. Why do they view the world in the way they view it? Including materials that provide visual representations of a number of different identities, not just white, able men and women. Include movies, readings, stories, songs that, even if not directly, allow learners to consider different ways of viewing the world. Include art. Which can help with that. What else do we have here? There is no need, another question there in the Q&A pod asks about helping getting learners to reflect on the purpose of the particular approach. Again, this is not a different teaching approach. This is not changing the way you go about your lessons. And this is not about convincing anyone. This is primarily about you being open to diversity, you being aware that every single learner in your class is different, even if they appear not to be. They come from different families, different backgrounds, different experiences. So it's about creating that space where everyone feels safe to share their opinion, to share things about themselves if they want to talk about what they like, what they don't like, what they dream of. I'm not sure how we're doing in terms of time. So if somebody could let me know, that'd be great.
2 more minutes.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. And there is one more question here about the framework to make lessons more inclusive, which teachers can use when planning lessons. There are a number of frameworks that talk about materials design, or even in class, the catering to a more inclusive environment. What I will do, I'll just need a minute to do that, is I'll share a link with you in the chat, if that's okay. But please allow me a moment while we are wrapping up the session. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm also checking the chat. And it was lovely talking to everyone today. Thank you for your comments. And I hope today's session just gave you something to consider about your role, our role as educators, and perhaps moving from being the language teacher to being an educator.
Angelos, thank you very much. That was very good, very interesting. I love the idea that you talked about, engaging with difference. I think that's really important. And something else I really I can't remember the exact phrase you used, but you talk about kind of teaching for the future. And I love that idea that, we have to remember that, as adults and older people, we might have one way of thinking, but actually, the kids will have different ways of thinking by the time that they grow up. So we need to kind of teach for that, thinking about what things will be important and relevant in 10, 20, 30 years time, and making sure that they have the vocabulary and the kind of the cognitive skills to be able to deal with those kind of the changes that inevitably happen through all generations. So I think that was really good.
Absolutely.
Okay, everyone, we're going to have a 5-minute break, and we'll see you soon with our next presentation.